I've done a couple of reviews so far where I've broken down several popular teen drama adaptations like Riverdale and 13 Reasons Why and tried to analyze why they didn't work. As a result, I've been getting a lot of comments like, Sarah, you just hate teen dramas, or Sarah, you just hate adaptations, or Sarah, why don't you review something you actually liked for once? So I thought I would talk a bit about a teen drama adaptation that I actually really liked. The End of the Fucking World is an offbeat Netflix original based on a 2013 graphic novel by Charles Forsman. It follows the story of two misfit teenagers named James and Alyssa as their runaway adventure develops into a fucked up, albeit kind of heartwarming love story. And it's great. It's just the right level of quirky and dreamlike while still giving you a very charming and poignant look into the lives of these two very damaged teenagers. It tells a great story about love, human connection, and emotional intimacy, and it was really well received, earning a stunning 98% on Rotten Tomatoes. In a world where a lot of teen drama adaptations like Pretty Little Liars are not well liked, this show is a lovable diamond in the rough. The very negative response to a lot of other adaptations, however, does beg the question of what makes some adaptations successful while others fail, and this particular show is a great vessel through which to analyze how to make both a successful adaptation and a great standalone show. First, let's talk about changes. Now, with any adaptation, successful or not, you are going to have to make changes. Even the most faithful and critically acclaimed of adaptations tend to have to switch a few things around. For example, consider the wildly successful film adaptation of the children's classic Holes. Holes managed to keep the vast majority of plot points exactly the same, but a few things still needed to be changed as a result of adapting this to a different medium. For instance, Stanley was supposed to be very pudgy at first and then rapidly lose weight as a result of working at the camp. They couldn't ethically do this with a child actor, though, and CGI would likely be expensive and fake-looking, so Shia LaBeouf stays the same weight throughout the movie. This is a great example of why changes in story and characters necessarily happen with a change of medium. When you don't have actors to worry about, you have a lot more freedom in terms of, say, changing the characters' physiques. When you do, however, you need to make changes accordingly. Another such example is A Series of Unfortunate Events, which has a great scene in one of its books where Sunny climbs up an elevator shaft using only her teeth. The books take place in a different reality than our own, and you get a sense that the physics work a little bit differently. It's almost cartoonish. But if this were to happen in real life, it would look ridiculous, and the audience's bullshit detectors would be going off immediately. That's why this might work if you were making, say, an animated adaptation, but the live-action show had to change it. There are also instances where changes are made not because of a new medium, but because things in the original were either poorly aged or just bad. For instance, right before its climax, no pun intended, the It novel inexplicably features a 10-page long child orgy initiated by the token girl, where all the male characters sleep with her as a way of affirming their masculinity in adulthood. The recent film adaptation, on the other hand, replaced this with a chaste kiss because of fucking course they did. Of course, you're inevitably going to have people who just hate any and all change, no matter what the purpose. But for adaptations where the changes don't work, criticism typically comes not because things are different, but because rather than a change being made to fit a new medium or make the original better, it's a change that feels like it was implemented just because, or actively makes an adaptation worse. For instance, we have Riverdale turning Archie's 60-something homeroom teacher into a 30-something-year-old sex predator because drama. So how do the changes in The End of the Fucking World fit into all of this? So, with The End of the Fucking World, the original medium is very different than the TV show. The comic is drawn in a very minimalistic style. There are no colors, everyone's facial features are very simplistic, and the detail and scenery are as minimal as possible. It works for that medium because the focus is about telling a compelling and emotional story. Minimizing all the other elements of the graphic novel has twofold benefits. First, it makes what the comic does choose to emphasize, that is, the characterization and dialogue, seem more pronounced. And secondly, on those rare occasions where the graphic novel suddenly does get very detailed, this is a visual cue to the audience that this is a significant moment. It's striking. But you can't do that with a TV show. Sure, you can make it black and white if you want, but you're never going to attain the exact same minimalist aesthetic that a hand-drawn comic with few backgrounds ever will, especially not in a way that looks natural to an audience. The show still wants to emphasize the same themes that are present within the comic, but it's going to have to go about it in a fundamentally very different way because of the nature of the medium. So what does it do? For one thing, the show doesn't shy away from detail. The sets, the scenery, and the makeup are all very intricate, and all of them tell a visual story. Take Alyssa's dad's trailer. It tells you a lot about who he is as a character. Every background item tells you something else about him, from the empty beer can sitting on the table outside to the mismatched curtains inside. In a comic, especially one going for a very minimalistic style, all these details would just seem like clutter. But in a show, they enhance the world and give us lots of little insights into the lives of each character. Essentially, because the minimalist style of the comics wouldn't work in live action, they instead flip it on its head and use detail to its full advantage. That works here even though it's a big change, because both versions of the show are using the advantages of their chosen mediums to communicate the same primary themes. There are also a couple other fundamental differences between the comics and the show in terms of pacing. I won't call them issues because I do think that they are fine in the context of the original comic, but in a show that deals with much more realism, leaving these things unchanged simply wouldn't work. For instance, let's talk about the timeline. So in the original comic, several months take place between James and Alyssa running away and the ending. The way the comic runs through these events at the beginning also feels much more like a survey of the events than a comprehensive exploration into the characters' day-to-day lives. There are only a couple of instances where the comic decides to halt to a standstill and give us these intimate moment-to-moment details of what the characters are doing, and these moments are striking. The first of these is the dance scene between James and Alyssa after they've broken into the professor's house. It gives you 18 panels of this very slow, intimate event. Contrast it with how quickly they go over some of the other events. Just 8 panels with a very brief overview of what happened. James got into an argument with his dad, he punched him, he stole his car, and he drove off. It's a lot to happen in such a short amount of time, and almost as soon as it's introduced, it's over. Because the comic is going for a slow burn romance over a long period of time, and therefore doesn't have the space to show you every intimate day-to-day moment of these characters' lives unless they want a Homestuck-length creation, the comic needs to be sparing with what it depicts, which makes moments like the dance scene stand out even more. But this wouldn't work as a Netflix show for a couple of reasons. First of all, this survey style would essentially have to be a simple voiceover over some clips, and people tend to not like clip episodes. It's harder to get an emotional connection to the characters, and only slowing down on occasion to show you a few moments of intimacy would likely just feel weirdly paced in contrast with everything else. Also, because of the show's heightened realism, it seems a little hard to believe that these careless teenagers leaving behind mountains of evidence everywhere they go would take that long to get caught. So what the Netflix show does instead is change the timeline so that the entire show takes place over a couple of days. This serves the show for a couple of reasons. First of all, the lessened amount of time does feel a bit more realistic in terms of how long it would actually take for these teenagers to get caught given the way they behave. Does that mean everything in this entire show needs to be 100% accurate, or else it's a horrible, terrible, unrealistic show that
deserves to burn?
Well, no. Obviously, TV shows are going to present a much more high-stake, dramatized version of real life. If everything that ever happened on any TV show was completely true to most people's day-to-day lives, TV would be incredibly boring. But there are other benefits to the change in pacing as well. Because the show now takes place over a couple of days, we no longer need to quickly survey over significant moments in order to depict everything. Because of this, we can develop a much more intimate connection to these characters much more quickly. Instead of simply being told that James and Alyssa spent several months getting to know each other without being able to see much of it, we are able to see all of their interactions and get a very clear personal idea of how they develop an understanding of one another. We still get intimate moments like the dance scene, sure, but because we don't have months upon months to cover very quickly, we don't need to worry about either inadvertently creating a clip show or skipping over important development. For example, in the comic, we see a brief panel of their car crashed at the bottom of a ravine. We get the idea that this is something important that happened to them at the beginning of their running away, but not why it happened, what led up to it, or how they reacted. It still informs our understanding of the characters. For instance, we get the idea that they're maybe a bit reckless. But in the show, being able to see the circumstances leading up to it and how exactly James and Alyssa react to it, we immediately understand them better. Our connection to these characters becomes much more intimate and much more personal as a result. Essentially, this show has a very good understanding of what worked in its original medium that would never work in its new one, as well as what can be accomplished with the new medium that couldn't have been with the old one. While the themes of the show and what make it impactful stay the same, they change things that would have harmed the show if they'd been completely committed to making it the exact same as the graphic novel. Similarly, they don't make changes for the sole purpose of making changes. What they do is very deliberate and is conceived with two different mediums in mind. The comic was very good. It told an enjoyable, compelling story with a great theme, an engaging plot, and cool characters. But it wasn't perfect. Of course, neither is the show, but it does make a couple of improvements from the original comic that really enhance its quality. The very brief surveying style through which the comic introduces its characters is a necessity because of its medium, but it does mean that we can miss out on moments that could give us a deeper understanding of our characters. For example, the scene in the comic where James sticks his hand into a garbage disposal is given a bit more time in the show. It's also a deep fryer in the show, but whatever. In the comic, it's almost a throwaway moment without a justification given for it. From what we know of James and his ostensible lack of emotions, we can assume that it's done out of morbid curiosity. In the show, however, James tells us that this was done specifically out of a desire to feel something and it didn't work. The fact that James has gone to such extreme lengths to feel something and yet still hasn't gotten there makes the fact that Alyssa finally makes him feel something all the more impactful. There are also moments that are given more weight. For example, let's look at the scene where James kills the professor. Both in the comic and the show, we know that this character is a rapist because of the Polaroids that the couple finds depicting his past victims. And in both the comic and the show, James kills him after he threatens Alyssa. But the show is much more visceral in its depiction of the actual threat. Just contrast the two.
I'm sorry, so sorry.
Now, either way, the scene accomplishes its purpose. It sets off the chain of events leading up to the finale and brings James and Alyssa more closely together. But there are a few key differences that makes this scene stronger in the show. For one thing, James is very calm and efficient about it in the comic, and goes about the murder almost as soon as the professor begins talking. In the show, on the other hand, he was planning on killing Alyssa in that moment. He didn't know that he was going to end up killing the professor until Alyssa very nearly finds herself one of the professor's victims. The much more intimate way in which they depict the event adds to the gravity of the scene. In the comic, James also barely reacts after the fact, and even later admits that he still doesn't feel anything. In the show, however, this is a very impactful and emotional moment. Just contrast his reaction in the comic to what we saw earlier in the show. The show's choice is more effective for a couple of reasons. For one thing, both mediums want to make it clear that while at this point James is convinced that he's a psychopath, he isn't. He's emotionally stunted from the death of his mother, sure, but he's not incapable of empathy or of emotionally reacting to visceral situations. This is a huge moment. He's just changed his goal from kill Alyssa to protect her. So having James emotionally react not only to the physical act of the murder, but also to this huge shift in his motivations gives the scene the emotional weight that an act like this deserves. Oh, the professor is also like a Satanist in the comic instead of just being a fucked up guy. And his wife is like also in a Satanist cult and is also one of the officers tasked with finding them. It's kind of weird. The show's choice to add two different police officers who are just normal people with stories of their own whose lives we get some brief looks into was definitely a good one. The stabbing of Alyssa's dad is also stronger in the show. In fact, it's a little confusing in the comic. In the show, he calls the cops on James and Alyssa quickly stabs him in the leg. This represents a significant shift in Alyssa's character, because she's idealized her father so much prior to now. The acceptance that he's not the super cool mythical figure that she thought he was is a huge moment for her. Her father is fully conscious, and it's a big deal for Alyssa that she's able to face her father in this very personal way, even if it's, a stabbing. In the comic, however, it's James that does the stabbing. Alyssa's dad is asleep, and there's no real indication of how James even found out that he called the cops on them. It's not one of the comic's strong points, but by giving this moment to Alyssa and making the circumstances make a little bit more sense, they ended up making this moment a lot more emotionally significant. Finally, the comic is good, but it's also fairly short. The show manages to give a lot of its world more depth without it feeling like filler. In the comic, we barely get to see much of the teenagers' home lives. We know that Alyssa hates her stepdad, and we know that James doesn't get along with his dad, but we don't get to see much of why. With the introduction of these characters as proper members of the cast, we get a more well-rounded view of these people's lives. Better understanding their circumstances, in turn, lets us better understand them. All in all, while the comic was very good, there were a couple of key elements that it lacked, or moments that could have been improved upon. With the addition of several new characters and moments that worked, and the removal of characters and moments that didn't, the adaptation managed to understand what was and what wasn't going to make it an effective show. The much less long-winded version of what I've just told you is that the show understood what changes it should make and what it should keep the same. But beyond how well the Netflix original communicates what the comic was trying to say, how well does it perform as a standalone show? That is, if I had never read the comic, or never even knew that there was a comic, what merits does the end of the fucking world have by itself? One of the things I like about this show compared to something like Riverdale is that every detail is deliberate. On a larger scale, this also means that everything the characters do has consequence. James and Alyssa throwing their dishes into the professor's pool signifies their recklessness and their lack of regard for consequences to the audience, sure, but it's also, if you'll forgive the pun, not a throwaway moment. Little things that the characters leave behind end up factoring into the investigation, and you get the idea that every time a detail is added to the show, it's added for a reason and isn't simply forgotten shortly after it's mentioned. It's very obvious that a great amount of care and detail was put into this show. Because of the short time frame, we get to see almost every moment that these characters spend together, and we quickly build up an emotional connection with them. We start to really care about them as they start to really care about each other. The refreshing story is also supplemented with a great production quality. The stylized way in which the show is filmed gives it a distinct visual charm, and the 1960s-inspired soundtrack imbues it with a poignant, almost dreamy quality. Before I wrap this review up, I do want to mention the question of a second season. Apparently, some of the show's creators are thinking of making a season 2. This will probably make me like the show less, because I thought the ending was the perfect mix of ambiguity and embodying the show's main themes, and for me, compromising that ambiguity would mean compromising the quality of the show. It said everything that it needed to say, and I think the idea that all endings need perfectly complete conclusions for every possible loose end with answers wrapped up in a pretty bow and served directly to the audience in an easy-to-swallow format does more harm than it does good. That being said, this idea is still up in the air right now, and nothing has been confirmed. In terms of what we've actually been given thus far, this show manages to be poignant, comedic, and lovably morbid. The End of the Fucking World is a perfect example of how to do adaptations right. Every change has a clearly well-thought-out purpose, whether it's adapting the show to a different medium or improving on things that were somewhat lacking in the original source material. It uses each medium to its fullest extent to communicate the same message about love and human connection, albeit sometimes in different ways. It's a great adaptation. On top of that, it's a great show on its own. It's rife with memorable interactions, lovable characters, believable connections, and a high-quality production with cool music, beautiful cinematography, and a distinct style. In the words of Alyssa herself, this show is mega.